We're excited to present a new contemporary art auction here at Leonard called Centum. The idea really came about after our centenary year last year, where we officially reached our 100-year milestone, and so we decided to curate a sale of 100 different paintings by 100 different living Australian artists. And we really wanted to do this because contemporary art is often seen in the auction place, but in amongst mixed auctions, we really wanted to highlight it in a way that focused on contemporary art for the collector. There are so many great works in this auction, but today I'd just like to show you a few highlights, but I do encourage you to look at the full online catalogue or request a printed catalogue to see the full 100. When thinking of contemporary art in Australia at the moment, Ben Quilty is probably a name that most people would recognise. His works have been touring around state institutions across the last couple of years, and recent documentaries on him have really put him to the forefront of contemporary art in Australia. And we're so lucky to have a self-portrait of him in our auction. This work is from 2014, and it's of a common subject matter. Ben often did paint himself. He so beautifully looks at current affairs and issues of humans in the world and the positive and negative impacts of that. And he really draws that upon himself. And it's quite rare to see his self-portraits come onto the secondary market. And so we're so thrilled that we have such a great self-portrait to be featured in Centum. One of the key pieces in the auction is by Gary Sheed, who is considered probably one of Australia's leading figurative artists. And when he was young, he discovered the work of D.H. Lawrence, who he repeatedly draws upon throughout his paintings. So those works are now known as the D.H. Lawrence series, which continues to this day. His paintings are not considered a direct visual representation of the novels, but rather his own interpretation. In this painting, we see the kangaroo seated at the table, which commonly appears in Gary Sheed's paintings of this series, and really draws ties to the writings of D.H. Lawrence, who depicted the kangaroo as a symbol, really, of Australian landscape and of the Australian way of life. The D.H. Lawrence series is probably amongst Gary Sheed's most collectible, and when they do come to auction, they are highly sought after by Australian art collectors, and it's no surprise that they're in nearly every Australian institutional collection. Dale Hickey is an artist that I always knew we wanted to represent in Centum, and I think there's such an excellent example that we have here to present in the auction. It's, I have to say, probably one of my favourite pieces in the whole sale. Dale Hickey really is probably one of Australia's most recognised Australian abstract artists. He featured in the original field exhibition that was held at the National Gallery of Victoria in the 1960s and was re-exhibited in that exhibition when it was recreated in the last couple of years. He's such an influential figure for so many Australian abstract artists, and he continues to hold such a strong reputation. Dale Hickey was inspired by so many artists, European, American, and even Australian, but I think the influence of Mondrian is really prevalent in this work. We see this careful grid on the easel in the centre, flanked by the two gridded windows either side. Dale had the ability to portray items within the artist studio, a space that for some might be considered quite mundane, but it really was his everyday space. And here he makes it the focus of his painting. Hickey creates a beautifully balanced composition where we see objects ordered in such a way that there's a harmony to it. On the right, we see the perfect balance between the metal objects, almost as though they should tip over, but they don't. And the perfectly rolled up tube of paint sitting on the plinth on the left, next to the most simple of cups. This painting is one of the true highlights of our Centum auction, and likely one of the best examples of Dale Hickey's paintings to ever come to market. Michael Zavros's paintings are immaculate. They are so carefully and beautifully rendered, there's almost no evidence of the brush. He would draw inspiration from advertising material and fashion magazines such as GQ, and really looking at the concept of luxury and decadence, especially within fashion. And here we see two male figures side by side in slick and high-end suits, almost as though they're posed for a fashion shoot. In terms of contemporary art in Australia, representing female artists, the biggest name really has to be Katherine Barton. She dominates both the primary and secondary market, and it's really not hard to see why. And we're so excited to have a work of hers in our Centum auction. Katherine Barton's works have a particularly tactile quality to them. She often uses sewing, fabric, buttons, all mediums that are traditionally quite feminine. And I love how in this particular work, which she's called Boy Becoming Man, there's that great contrast and juxtaposition between what is something quite feminine with a male subject matter and a rite of passage for a male. Another key work that we have in the auction is by John Olsen. And John Olsen really is one of the most respected landscape artists in Australia. He reinvented the notion of the Australian landscape by looking at aerial perspective, and we see that again in this work here of the Torres Strait. The artwork here looks at the ocean from up above, and that really was a favourable perspective for John Olsen. We see the contrast between the beautiful softness of the watercolour with the directness of the free-flowing pastel lines coming through the work. This combination of the two mediums really shows the movement and dynamism of the ocean, which was a skill that is so unique to John Olsen in his art practice. This is just a selection of lots that feature in our Centum auction, but please, I invite you to browse the full catalogue on our website or in our printed catalogue to see the full 100.